After the COVID-19 pandemic, the functioning of major global economies and financial markets fundamentally changed due to a significant shift in the interconnection between monetary and fiscal policies. Simply put, the financial system now operates on an entirely different principles than it has been over the past few decades. Many people don't understand this, but this new dynamic will lead to a significant widening of wealth inequality by the end of the decade. The old rule of work hard and you'll earn a decent living no longer applies, and those without valuable and scarce assets will find themselves even worse off as the decade progresses. The current financial system has entered its final phase, an inflationary debt spiral. In this video, I will attempt to explain why this is happening and whether there's a way out of it, if at all, and how to best prepare for it. Until recently, the world operated under a more than a century-long order that has brought enormous prosperity, in particular to the United States. It was a world dominated by a single superpower that set the direction in all major global matters. And it did so with great success. No other power was strong enough to challenge it. The United States was, and in many ways still is, the leading political, military, financial, and economic force. One of the main pillars of its prosperity is the US dollar, which also recognizes the world's reserve currency. It is the most reliable, widely accepted, and useful currency in existence. Its strength is underpinned by the strict adherence to the rule of law and respect for the private ownership, the backing of the world's strongest economy and military, and by far the largest and most developed financial market. It is no wonder that US dollar is in such high demand. Since 1971, when the dollar was decoupled from gold, the currency has been stripped of any fundamental or real and tangible value. Instead, its value is derived from intangible factors such as trust in US legislation, the attractiveness of American financial markets, and the general consensus that accepts the dollar as a store of value. However, a key shift occurred since then. The US government, along with the Federal Reserve, took control of the American and by extension the global financial system. If communism taught the world anything, it's likely the lesson that central planning of complex systems such as the economy is beyond human capability. Nevertheless, the US and global financial systems have since that time essentially become centrally controlled by American backing and governmental authorities. Central control inevitably leads to an increasing number of poor decisions and potential for system abuse. Because the US financial market is by far the largest and most significant, and since all other currencies are tied to the dollar to some degree, whatever happens in the US impacts the entire world to varying extents. Over time, the US began exploiting this centralized control for its own benefit, for the world has begun to realize that current capitalism only works well if the population is growing and is relatively young and productive. Aging populations, declining birth rates, rising competition, a costly military and trade deficits has forced the United States to make a critical choice. Allow natural forces to take their course and watch Western power diminish in favor of the East, or artificially maintain that power even at the cost of destabilizing the global financial system. You can probably guess which path they chose, and that is the latter. It became the norm to expand the money supply through various means, whether by lowering interest rates to near zero, increasing government borrowing, or, more recently, by means of quantitative easing, which is essentially printing the money. Over the years, the growing money supply enriched American households and businesses, and it was more than offsetting the natural decline in American economic strength. In the early stages, this led to increased prosperity, and apart from economic theorists and American competitors, few had any major objections to this. It's worth noting that following the US example, virtually every country in the world began taking this miracle pill, even those that clearly didn't need it. In a world where everybody is looting the system, the only fool is the one who doesn't participate in the madness. That's why there isn't a single major country without significant national debt, and most countries are heavily indebted. Being the issuer of the world's reserve currency comes with one advantage. The ability to manipulate the currency for one's own benefit far exceeds what's possible with other currencies. Since replacing the US dollar is often prohibitively expensive or outright impossible, The world has no choice but to accept the monetary decisions made by American authorities. This is why nearly the entire world is, in a sense, trapped within the American monetary system. It is also one of the reasons, I believe, global indebtedness will continue to rise for many years before it reaches its limits. A sort of breaking point that could change this trajectory is currently nowhere to be seen. The problem with exploiting anything is that it inevitably leads to undesirable consequences over time. No system can be plundered indefinitely, and the increasing debt burdens of countries worldwide shorten the lifespan of the monetary system on which the global economy is built. The faster this exploitation occurs, the quicker we'll reach the breaking point. Therefore, the only thing governments can do is slow this process as much as possible by incurring debt at a slow pace. But why not stop borrowing altogether if the risks are so high? Unfortunately, that is no longer possible. This train is moving only in one direction, and it has just one pedal, the accelerator. Increasing the money supply through debt creates an unpleasant phenomenon, a debt spiral from which there is no escape. When debt levels become excessively high, as is the case with all major global economies, servicing that debt becomes such a significant expense in a state budget that tax revenues can no longer cover it. For example, the US now spends more on accumulated interest from its national debt than it does on its entire enormous military. The only way to survive another day is to rely on new debt, but no one lends money for free. While this approach addresses the short-term solvency issues, it worsens the problem obviously in the long term, because the interest payments accumulate. What follows, and has become particularly evident after the COVID-19 pandemic, is a fiscal dominance. The world is firmly trapped in a debt spiral, and it's only a matter of time before it becomes unbearable. The debt spiral is a long-term process characterized by growing inequalities in income and wealth among the population. The middle and lower classes are steadily losing wealth to the benefit of the upper class. During a period of fiscal dominance, most newly created money inevitably ends up in the financial markets, and thus primarily in the hands of the wealthy. Fiscal dominance refers to a phenomenon where fiscal or government policy takes the precedence, while monetary policy, traditionally used to steer the economic cycles, becomes ineffective. Monetary policy controlled by central banks typically influences how much private businesses and households in the economy borrow by adjusting the interest rates. Lower interest rates encourage borrowing, boosting economic activity, while higher rates have the opposite effect. For a long time, central banks managed economic cycles effectively through this mechanism and were able to regulate inflation. However, government debt operates under different rules than the private debt, which is dictated by central banks. Interest rates have little impact on government decisions regarding how much new debt to issue in a given period. As total national debt increases, annual government deficits inevitably rise because repayments on the existing debt accumulate over time. The United States has now reached the point where the annual government deficits are so massive they exceed the creation of private sector debt. Simply put, the economic cycles are increasingly driven by the government spending rather than private sector activity. This is tragic, of course, because it reduces the scope of the free market economy, gradually transforming it into a centrally controlled economy. Making matters worse, central banks are losing their influence and can no longer effectively control inflation. Under normal circumstances, when the economic activity is too high, central banks temporarily raise interest rates to curb the new debt creation. This cools economic activity and brings inflation back to lower levels. In a world where government debt accounts for most of the newly created debt, the only reliable guarantee of low inflation is government restraint. However, as mentioned earlier, this restraint is only partially within the control of policymakers. The inflationary debt spiral does not answer to any politician. For this reason, coupled with the conflicts of interest inherent in politics, it is almost certain that governments are unreliable guarantee of low inflation. This is precisely why independent central banks exist. The world is therefore in a debt crisis that negatively impacts almost everything, either directly or more often indirectly, and in ways that are difficult to notice. For the reasons outlined in this video, this crisis will likely deepen in the years to come. The situation cannot be easily resolved, and even the strongest and most powerful countries in the world are becoming powerless against this structural issue. A prolonged period of elevated inflation and rapidly growing government debt is what we can expect in the coming years. Now more than ever, it is crucial to own valuable and scarce assets such as stocks, real estate, and gold. As described earlier, much of the newly created debt eventually finds its way into financial markets. Investing will therefore become a necessity, not merely an option, in the coming years. Owning such assets is the only way to preserve purchasing power during these turbulent times, even with high valuations. While the concept of devaluation really loses significance in an era of fiscal dominance, in a world where money is printed on such a scale, it becomes nearly impossible to determine the value of anything. Interestingly, the final phase of the inflationary debt spiral is not a new phenomenon at all. For example, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, and the Dutch colonial empire all faced the same problem in the final stages of their global dominance. Printing money is akin to a cry for help in a house collapsing under its own weight. This historical pattern is well documented by legendary investor Ray Dalio, either on his YouTube channel or in his recently released book, The Changing World Order. So fasten your seatbelts, because this wild ride is just beginning.